Have you ever looked at a pattern in your life, a way you respond, a type of person you choose, a belief you carry about yourself, and wondered where it actually came from? Not the surface answer, but the real one. Because sometimes the wounds we carry are not entirely our own. Sometimes they were inherited from a mother who inherited from theirs, from a father who never had the tools to heal his, or from a family system that passed pain down through generations, not out of cruelty, but because no one ever stopped long enough to look at it, to name it, and to choose something different. Welcome back to the Wonders Within podcast. I'm Nikki Denham, founder of Wellness Wonders Australia. And in today's episode, we will be talking about intergenerational trauma, what it is, how it shows up in our lives, the patterns it creates, and the invisible ways it can shape our relationships, our nervous system, and the stories we believe about ourselves. And most importantly, we'll explore the possibility of healing, what it means to become the person in the lineage who says it ends with me. Because while we don't get to choose everything we inherit, we do get to choose what we carry forward. Now, my mum was just 16 years old when she had me, and truthfully, I almost didn't survive. I was born with a rare condition called exomphalos, which is a birth defect where the abdominal wall doesn't fully form and close during pregnancy, leaving the intestines and sometimes other organs developing outside of the body, exposed, unprotected, and vulnerable. Now, everything that should have been safely held inside wasn't. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that image over the years because in many ways it became a metaphor for the life that followed. Now, so much of me lived exposed, carrying pain I didn't understand, trying to protect parts of myself that never felt protected. And by all accounts, I shouldn't have survived, but I did. And I've come to believe that the part of me that fought to stay alive in those final hours is the same part of me that kept fighting through every chapter that followed. Through every heartbreak, every trauma, every season that should have broken me, something inside me refused to let go. And maybe somewhere deep down, I already knew there was more life waiting for me. Now, my grandparents were beautiful people, kind, gentle, and safe. And their home felt like an exhale. With them, I could simply be a child. I didn't have to watch every word or brace for what might happen next. That relationship was incredibly important to me because it reminded me that love existed and it was real. Safety was real and gentleness was real. And somehow that made the rest of my childhood even harder to understand. Because how could warmth exist in one room while something so different exists in another? How could love and hurt live under the same family tree? Now, for years, I searched for a neat explanation, a beginning or someone to blame, a reason that would make everything make sense. But I never found one. But what I found instead was something far more important, the understanding that none of it was my fault, and that changed everything. Because that's often how intergenerational trauma works. It rarely begins with us, and it rarely moves through generations in obvious ways. It changes shape, it adapts. Sometimes it looks like anger, sometimes addiction, sometimes perfectionism, sometimes emotional absence, sometimes choosing relationships that create what was once familiar. Now, for me, it showed up in all of those places. It showed up in the relationships I chose, in the survival strategies I mistook for personality, in the ways my own unresolved pain sometimes prevented me from fully seeing what my children needed from me, until eventually my nervous system reached its limit. I lost my children. Now, not simply through estrangement, but through a complete psychological collapse that resulted in me being hospitalised, diagnosed, and medicated. Now, my body had been carrying too much for far too long. Childhood wounds, an abusive second marriage, grief, and shame, and the consequences of choices I made from places that had never been healed. I held it all together the only way that I knew how, by surviving, until surviving wasn't enough anymore. And for the first time in my life, I stopped. And not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't keep going. Looking back now, I realized that stopping wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a completely different one. Healing began with clinical work, therapy, medication. 15 years with the same incredible therapists who helped me untangle more than I could ever put into words. I needed every one of those years. Then, about 3 years ago, another layer of healing opened. Now, not instead of therapy, but alongside it. I discovered nervous system regulation, somatic practices, breath work, meditation, and inner child work. And slowly I stopped asking what's wrong with me and started asking what happened to me? What do I need now? And who am I becoming? And little by little, I became someone I never knew before. A woman who wasn't constantly trying to earn her worth. A woman who knew herself, who trusted herself, who loved herself, and not as a performance and not as something she said in front of the mirror, but as something she lived. Every single day, those practices didn't erase my past. They gave me the capacity to hold it different. And today I have rebuilt a deep, loving relationship with my boys, and that relationship is precious to me. And it reminds me that healing is possible. Now, my relationship with my daughter is different and still fractured, and that story is still unfolding. It's tender, it's painful, but it's filled with hope, grief, and love all existing together. And I've learned that healing doesn't always mean every relationship returns to what it once was. Sometimes healing is becoming the kind of person who can meet whatever comes next with openness instead of old survival patterns. And that's where I am now. I'm no longer living from the wounds that raised me. I'm living from the awareness I have fought to build. The cycle ends with me. Not because I've done everything perfectly, because I haven't. And not because I haven't caused pain, because I have. But because I was willing to stop, to look honestly at my life, to take responsibility for what was mine, to grieve and let go of what wasn't, and to understand what had been handed to me, and what, without meaning to, I had begun handing to the next generation. And then with everything I had, I chose something different, and I chose to let it end here. Intergenerational trauma is exactly what it sounds like. Trauma that moves through generations. And it was first studied in the children of Holocaust survivors, when researchers began noticing something remarkable. These children were showing trauma responses to experiences they had never lived through themselves. Now, something in their body and in their nervous system was carrying forward what had not been processed or healed. And since then, the research has expanded significantly. And now we understand that trauma can be transmitted in a number of ways. Through parenting, so the way a traumatized parent responds to their child, the inconsistency, the emotional absence, and the lack of attunement or felt safety. All of these shape a child's developing nervous system. It teaches the body what to expect from the world long before language ever can. Through epigenetics. So research now shows that traumatic experiences can actually influence gene expression, and some of those changes can be passed down biologically. In other words, the body can carry the imprint of what came before. And through story and silence. So what is not spoken about in a family is never absent. It still lives in the room, and children are incredibly sensitive to what is felt but not named. And they build their understanding of safety, love, relationships, and their own worth around those unspoken dynamics. And here's what matters most to understand. None of this is about blame. That's what makes this generation different. We now have awareness, we have language, we have research, tools, and communities of people doing this work consciously, which means we can finally do something different with it. We can look at it, we can name it, and we can meet it with compassion instead of repetition. And that choice, that moment of awareness, is where the cycle begins to shift. Not through perfection, not through getting it all right, but through the willingness to pause, to see, and to begin again from a different place. Now, here's what I'd love you to sit with this week. Go grab your journal and find a quiet moment and ask, what did I inherit? Now, not just the obvious things like eye color or your laugh, but the beliefs, the patterns, the ways of relating, the things I do in moments of stress or fear or love that feel familiar in a way that I can't quite explain. And then ask, where did these things come from? Now, ask it not to assign blame, but just to trace the thread, to see it clearly. And then the most important question of all, what do I want to pass on instead? because that is where the power lives, not in the wound, but in the choice. Now, when I sat with this myself, the answer was clear. I want to pass on the woman who knew herself, who loved herself, who did the hard and unglamorous work of healing, so that the people who came after her, her children, her grandchildren, and women she will never meet, all carry a little less than what she did. Now, if something in this episode felt familiar, like it echoed a story you've lived in your own way, I want you to hold this gently. You are not here to carry everything that came before you. You are here to become conscious of it, because awareness changes what repetition once held in place. And every time you notice a pattern instead of unconsciously living it, something in your lineage shifts. Not loudly, not perfectly, but meaningfully. And that matters more than we often realize. So thank you for sitting with me through this one. This was the episode I've been building towards, and I hope across the last 12 episodes you've felt something shift, even a little, even quietly, because that is how it begins, not with a dramatic movement, but with everything suddenly making sense. With a woman sitting somewhere, maybe in her car, maybe on a walk, maybe in her kitchen with her earphones in, hearing something that sounds like her own story told back to her, and deciding, maybe for the first time, that she deserves to heal too. If that woman is you, I am so glad that you're here. The wounds we inherit are real, and the pain is real. And the choice to end it in your body, in your lifetime, and in the way that you show up for yourself and the people you love, that is real too. You are not your mother's story. You are not your grandmother's story. You are the woman who stopped, who looked, and who chose. And that changes everything. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.